This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kansas Farm Service Agency Agricultural Program Specialist Allison Womack starts the show as she chats about county committee elections, the Emergency Conservation Program, acreage reporting, and other FSA programs. Continuing the show is Brian Washburn, physicist and project leader at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, discussing how he and a team are using lasers to measure cow burps. Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Herrin in the show as they talk about Redwater Disease and what it is on a recent Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from the Farm Service Agency. And today, we're joined by Agricultural Program Specialist with the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Allison Womack. Allison, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Happy to be here.
Allison, first wanting to talk about something that people may have recently received a note about in the mail, county committee elections.
That's correct. So the County Office Committee, also known as COC elections, provide farmers and ranchers with the opportunity to run for and be elected to represent producers in their community on their local FSA COC. Producers are encouraged to consider running for COC seats. Our county committees are a critical component of day-to-day operations for FSA. They allow grassroots input and location administration of federal farm programs. Nationwide, we have 7,700 dedicated members of the agricultural community to serve on FSA COCs. Recently, the National FSA Office has mailed one postcard per household to eligible voters, letting them know that their local administrative area, also known as an LAA, is identified as holding an election in 2025. So eligible candidates can nominate themselves or nominate an eligible producer with records administered in the same COC jurisdiction. The nomination period runs from Monday, June 16th through Friday, August 1st, 2025. To be nominated, a producer must complete the FSA 669A, which is the nomination form for the county FSA committee election. Completed forms must be provided to a service center by close of business on that Friday, the August 1st of 25. And if you're interested, contact your local service center for more information on the nomination process.
Is every place in Kansas having nominations or just certain places?
Just certain local administrative areas. So your county may have 3 different LAAs, so maybe only one is open right now. It all depends on the rotation, essentially. You'll serve a 3-year term, so depending on what part of your county has an LAA open. Typically, it's one LAA per county, but it just depends.
And something else currently taking place, the Emergency Conservation Program. And first, what is the Emergency Conservation Program?
Sure. So the Emergency Conservation Program helps with disasters. For triggering disaster events, they provide cost share on certain payment scenarios. So currently, we had a couple tornadoes come through Kansas in May. So counties that are eligible for potential cost share on payment scenarios for debris cleanup and fence repair due to those tornadoes are going to be Pratt, Reno, and Kiowa counties. So if you're in those areas and you were affected by the tornado, reach out to your service center. We also have a couple lingering drought counties in the state. Obviously, we've done a lot better this year drought-wise than we were in the past couple years, but Rush and Pawnee are still real dry, and so they have qualified for ECP for drought-related potential cost share out there. So if you have a water source that is dry and you are in Rush or Pawnee County, reach out to those local service centers so we can get you signed up.
And so for anything Emergency Conservation Program related, reach out to the center to figure out what they could maybe help with?
Correct. So you have to have a triggering disaster event. So for Kansas right now, we just have the drought in Rush and Pawnee and then those counties affected by the tornado. And knock on wood, that's all we have. But in the event that there is a disaster, that's always a program we could potentially implement.
Another program with the Farm Service Agency, Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, and anything currently happening with that?
We are anticipating a grassland sign up at any time. Your grassland CRP does not require cropping history. So continuous and general CRPs do require cropping history. However, grassland is a working lands program, so you can either hay or graze those acreages contingent upon a conservation plan that you establish with NRCS. But it is the one CRP program that does not require cropping history. We are also still accepting offers on continuous CRPs. Continuous CRPs are typically smaller acreages that are going to be addressing a specific resource concern, improving wetlands, improving water quality, enhancing wildlife, reducing soil erosion, and protecting sensitive areas. So those particular offers, continuous, we're accepting offers through July 31st. It's a little bit different than previous signups. We are submitting those offers to a batching process that the national office does. Because we haven't gotten a new farm bill, we're still at a statutory cap of CRP acres nationwide. So the batching process, I think, is designed to help keep us under that statutory cap of acres, because general's included in that, grassland, and then continuous. So for now, we anticipate offers being batched July 31st for continuous acreages.
And when you say batched, what do you mean by that?
That's a great question. There's some kind of criteria the national office is looking at to determine, I guess, needs and feasibility probably for those. Grassland is also kind of similar to general CRP, so you're going to submit those offers and then you will be ranked nationwide. So if you're in a low priority area, you're probably less likely to get accepted into the grassland program, but it's always worth a shot. You never know how it's going to go. So,
how can producers know when grassland CRP sign up has opened up?
I believe all of our socials, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, is all going to announce that. Farmers.gov will also unroll that announcement, but we anticipate it any day, so hopefully soon.
And as producers and growers are getting crops in and out of the field right now, any reminders when it comes to acreage reporting?
Yes, acreage reporting. So deadline to report your CRP acres, grass acres, any spring-seeded crops, cover crops, grass, all of those. The deadline to report those acres is July 15th. If you have hemp, that's a different deadline. That's going to be July 31st. But while you are in your county office, make sure you're talking with your program analysts or any employee. Did you plant a cover crop? If you're reporting wheat or another small grain, will those acres also be grazed? If you have grain sorghum, confirm if it's a dual purpose, and if so, bring in your seed tickets for the county office to take a copy of. On your grazed crops, make sure you have your planting dates. Do you have a subsequent crop planted? Did you double crop beans? Ensure you're reporting those acres and those plant dates. If you planted alfalfa, clover, or another similar legume, is the stand at least 60%? Otherwise, it needs to be reported as a mixed forage. Do you have prevent plant acres? If so, you're probably going to have some more paperwork that will have you fill out. Another thing, did you break out new ground? If so, expect more paperwork. Just make sure before you're leaving the office, make sure you're going over those 578 acres with somebody in the office. Confirm your total acres, confirm your shares, your intended use. Acreage reporting is kind of the foundation for a lot of our programs. And with a farm bill currently being written, we don't know, maybe there's going to be an ad hoc program. A lot of our programs are based on acreage reporting, so it saves work and headaches in the long run if you take the time to ensure you're reporting it accurately right now.
So if any grower went in the field with a planter or a drill or anything along those lines, tell a Farm Service agency about it probably?
Yes, please.
And Allison, also just wanting to put a reminder for the marketing assistance loans.
Right. As we're getting into wheat harvest, just be aware that marketing assistance loans are short-term loans designed to allow for cash flow. They have a low interest rate compared to your local bank. Right now, I believe the rate is 5%. 9-month in length. We don't ask what you're using the money for. It's always a question for me in the field. 9 months in length, short term, get some cash flow in your pockets while, markets might be flooded. It's just a great operating tool for you all out there.
Allison, and as always, wanting to do the reminder of where people can find out more information.
Farmers.gov.
Allison, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Kansas Farm Service Agency Agricultural Program Specialist Allison Womack. As always, you can find more information online at Farmers.gov, which I will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins as they discuss New World screwworm control.
A new sterile fly dispersal facility in our country to keep away the threat of New World screwworm,
which would devastate ranchers who raise our cattle, our sheep, our goats, and our horses, especially and obviously if it made its way across the southern border.
Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins earlier this week in Texas announcing the facility near the U.S.-Mexican border to complement existing fly dispersal centers in Mexico and Panama. Besides more Air Force Base being a previous sterile fly dispersal facility to combat NWS decades earlier, the Secretary explained another logistical reason for the site.
The benefit of that is that we're closer to Texas and to the American border. So rather than relying on the flies flying up from way south, they'll come from a lot closer. So it is the dispersal facility. We are working hand in glove with the Mexican government.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because once we come back, we'll be joined by Brian Washburn as he talks about research he is doing that involves lasers and cow burps. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about cows and lasers with physicist and project leader at the National Institute for Standards and Technology, Brian Washburn. Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Brian, as we're talking about cows and lasers, what are you looking at?
So we're trying to do measurements to give either information to ranchers or farmers about, without disturbing the animals, we want to get some information about the production of meat or the impact environment that the raising of the cattle does. Okay. And so we can use, basically cattle they exhale, so they produce carbon dioxide, there's water in the air. And then also cattle, they digest food differently than humans do. And they have a process called enteric fermentation, where they have a forestomach and they produce methane as they chew their cud or whatever the animals you want to say they do. So they belch this methane up. And the question is, and methane does impact the environment. So the question is, how much methane do they produce? And so about 5-6 years ago, people in the physics department at Kansas State University and in agronomy said, well, we have lasers, and one thing we can do with lasers is detect trace gases like methane. And a trace gas is the atmosphere has nitrogen and oxygen, and there's some very small quantities of gases like methane and carbon dioxide that you can detect. They're not a lot of them, but they're impactful. And so you can use a laser and say, how do you use a laser to detect the gas? Well, what happens is the gas absorbs specific colors of a laser, and we know those colors from doing lab measurements. And so if we send a laser out that actually can get absorbed a little bit by this gas, that tells us the gas is there. If it doesn't get absorbed, then the gas isn't there. And so we can do, and this is called spectroscopy, so we can do high-resolution spectroscopy with lasers. And these are very special lasers, they're pulse lasers, but they're called a frequency comb, which is actually a Nobel Prize-winning technology, which a little too much detail for this. But we use these very special lasers, which we actually make, and we can use this to measure methane and carbon dioxide and water vapor associated with any kind of agricultural practice.
So, Brian, as you're talking about lasers, are they on the ground, in the sky? How is this working?
So this isn't a Death Star laser. This is a weak laser, okay? All right, so, and that means it has to be eye safe, and that means that it does not damage the eye, even if you look into the laser. So it's a very weak laser. It's an infrared laser, so you cannot see it. Okay, so it's not a visible laser. Okay, so it's a weak visible laser but basically produces and then we launch it at head height, roughly from what I would consider a telescope. It looks like a telescope, like instead of light going into it, light comes out of it. And then it goes 400 meters or, somewhere between 100 and 400 meters to a mirror. And then that mirror reflects the light back. And then it goes back where it came. And there's a little sensor there that detects that and turns that light into electrical signal, which onto that electrical signal is the information we need to know about the gases. The one unique thing about this is essentially what we do is we set up two laser. So say you have an area where all the animals are. You set up a beam on one side, a beam on the other, and then any gas that's produced in that area. So we can cover large areas. And so we're not looking at emissions from a single animal. We're looking at emissions from a whole area, and that's the strength of the technique. There are other ways to look at emissions, like at Kansas State University, they have this instrument called a green feed, where essentially an animal sticks its head in, it belches some gas up and gets a treat, and you can measure how much methane comes from that animal. That's not what we do. Well, we were about to do a comparison measure between that and the lasers.
Why do you see this as something that's really important and something you've put time and effort into?
So these are questions like for feed productions, there's consumers want to purchase meat, but want to reduce the impact of the production of meat on the environment. And so then there might be simple ways or additives or things you can do to the diet of the animals to reduce the methane production. So for example, there might be a common thing is to feed animals seaweed or some other kind of additive. The measurement we just did recently, which we did in Parsons, Kansas, looked at feeding. So that at a feedlot, you would normally feed them a corn-based diet with some kind of roughage. And in this study, we actually looked at sorghum. And instead of corn, the reason why we did that was because sorghum is a less water-intensive crop to grow. That's grown in Kansas. And so the question is, can you get the same yield from feeding animals, the growth, in terms of weight? I'm not an animal expert, but can you feed these animals sorghum-based feed? And so what we did a study where we had a group of animals fed a sorghum-based diet plus compared to the normal corn-based diet. And we measured how much carbon dioxide and water vapor and methane was produced from that. And we actually saw an impact, which we saw a reduction in the methane produced from the animals fed sorghum versus corn. And so that says, hey, and with not, like I can't talk about the animal side of it, but there was still good growth productions on the weight gain of the animals. So,
have you done more research studies besides the one that you've recently completed in Parsons?
So we've done two other studies, both in Manhattan. The first study was done in K-State, was just more of a proof of principle. Can we measure methane emissions from animals at a small feedlot and get a number that was accepted? And it was basically a test of whether we can do that. And we did that. And we did that measurement at the beef stocker unit on the west side of Manhattan, and that was successful. And then the other thing we did was looking at, so during the life cycle of an animal, most of the time they're grazing. And the question is, as these animals eat a different diet, people anticipate them to produce more methane than when they're in a feedlot. And the question is, can we actually measure that? And that's a harder problem because when animals graze, there's less of them, so they're producing overall less gas. And so we did what we call a controlled release measurement. What that means, we released a certain amount of gas, and then we said, okay, did we see that gas? And so we did that on the east side of town at the K-State Reynolds Ranch, and that's where they do studies of grazing animals. And we're continuing to do work there as well.
How do you see this being applicable into the future?
So the idea is to do farm-scale measurements to inform people or stakeholders, whether it be ranchers or corporations, or, for example, a company makes a product and they say this reduces methane by, or this reduces emissions by so much. And since our lasers go back to basic physics, we can do a measurement, to actually a truth measurement, to say that a product does this, or a management technique. We do this, and we expect to reduce methane production or even ammonia. Ammonia, I didn't mention ammonia. Ammonia is another gas that we measure, and that gas is produced as the animals urinate in the ground. They produce this ammonia, and it's a pollutant gas. Can you do something? Can you do something to the ground to mitigate, make sure all that ammonia doesn't end up in the air?
Who else is working on this project with you?
So my main collaborator at Kansas State University's Dr. Eduardo Santos in the agronomy department, but there's still people in the physics department, Brett DePaula and Cosmin Blaga. They're in the physics department. And then we also work with people in animal science and industry. So that'd be like Jim Drouillard, Logan Thompson. And then we also work with Sarah Sexton-Bowser, and she's in agronomy, but also with the Sorghum Institute. So it's this very unique collection of people from different sides of agriculture, right? From animal science and industry, from agronomy, and then people on my side who are the laser experts. So, and then this is I work for the federal government, right? So this is a collaboration between a state university and the federal government, right?
What makes you excited then to be continuing working with lasers and cow burps?
So this goes back to the lasers here are a special laser. It's called a frequency comb. It was developed 20 years ago for better atomic clocks. And I worked on this type of laser 20 years ago. And you might not think, well, making a better atomic clock has anything to do with cow burps in it, but it does if you know a little bit about it. And what I find unique about it is that this idea, which this laser concept, which won a Nobel Prize or something very different, is applied for something that can help other groups of people out, right? So timekeeping is very important for a lot of things, so this laser helps with timekeeping, but also helps with management of cattle and hopefully in the future management of crops and things like that.
Brian, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was physicist and a project leader at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Brian Washburn, as he discussed using lasers to track cow burps. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Kansas State University's Beef Cattle Institute as we hear part of their Cattle Chat podcast from Brad White, Bob Larson, and special guest Brian Herrin. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, and special guest Brian Herrin.
We had a question from a listener that was in Iowa, and we had talked about clostridial diseases before, but he brought up and asked about Redwater disease. So I'm going to ask you guys, what is Redwater disease? And are we always describing the same thing when we say Redwater?
Good question. So one of the specific things that this listener asked was clostridial diseases, soil-borne, spore-forming bacteria. So it can be a lot of different places. But for this one, we typically think of the southeast part of the United States as being more common. So his question was, can it happen in Iowa? Well, I would say yes, that it can, but there are some geographic areas where it's more common. But again, it's a clostridial, so it's soil-borne. Cattle pick it up from the environment. This particular clostridium, you will see some urinary tract signs where that's where the Redwater name comes from, which makes it similar to other clostridial diseases, but different. And some of the risk factors are the same.
Do you remember which species of Clostridia it was?
I do not.
Okay.
I kind of remember or somebody describing, or maybe not using the term Redwater, but a similar thing that was Babesia related. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the difference. That's reaching back too far in my brain.
Brian?
Well, and it may be one of those catch-all terms. It's just kind of used for things that cause red blood cell rupture, and so then your kidneys are filtering it out. And
so it could be a number of causes.
Got red water as you have like blood in the urine or hemoglobin in the urine. And so it's kind of a catch-all term for something that.
So other things like leptospirosis and other things that can cause some kidney infections or, again, lysis of red blood cells. So it's not for sure that this was a clostridial disease, but could it have been? Yeah, it could have been.
Yeah, and anything else we would think about when you think about Redwater? And there's some discussion of flukes and clostridial disease. How does that process work?
There is kind of this underlying idea that clostridial diseases can be kind of moved through the liver with liver fluke migration. I will say we have a great team of people who study liver clostridial diseases here at Kansas State. And when I got here, I was like, oh, do you ever see any flukes? This is what we were taught, and we have the experts here. And they said, no, we don't know what you're talking about. And I said, what? And I went looking through the literature, and I found a report from 1940-something out of Europe that suggested that liver flukes could be moving clostridial diseases through the liver with very little else supporting evidence that that's true.
Somebody's thought.
And, I went through my whole PhD training thinking liver flukes, clostridial diseases, they're one-to-one, they go together. May or may not be true. Obviously, it's not great to have something Swiss cheesing around through your liver, but most of our liver issues are probably not associated with liver flukes, and there's a wide variety of other things that can cause that, right?
Yeah, and the liver flukes are limited to a certain region of the country, or where do we typically see those?
We think of them southeast again. I think in swampy, wet areas because there is a snail associated with that life cycle. But we see cases in Kansas every year.
Yeah,
they pop up sporadically, and we don't have very good surveillance to say like I can give an idea where the risk is. And it tends when it pops up to be really focal because it means the parasite got in to your farm pond. Right? There's lots of snails here. There'll be probably good intermediate hosts. And so if the parasite makes it to your farm pond, you now are focally positive for that disease. And then that could be difficult to manage from there on.
Yeah. And as long as those snails can overwinter, they can hold the parasite with them from year to year.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the issue is it's really difficult to get rid of it because you can't really treat your pond for the snails. It's kind of now an illegal issue. And so once it's there, it becomes a real managing it issue.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. You can hear the full episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Cattle Chat on your favorite podcast streaming platform. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.